Hello and welcome back to another edition of SNJ In Conversation with me, Tania and we're back with Anne Heavey, Director of Whole School Send, and also joined by Renata.
Hello, welcome back, Anne.
Pleasure, thank you for having me.
So Anne's here today to talk about another aspect of her work. She's recently taken over as head of the Send Specialist Curriculum for OakAcademy, which as you may know, was the online school that set up speedily at the beginning of the pandemic. It's now been funded by government to provide 10,000 lessons. And it began without any send offer at all, which, you know, in the haste is kind of understandable, but it soon included a small level of send, mainly for those with more severe learning disabilities. But many parents have been feeling that the regular lessons aren't really suitable differentiation style for SEND learners, which is quite a task when you consider how many children with SEND there are out there, how many different ways they have of learning. So Anne, how are you approaching your role? Can Oak offer a real alternative for children with different levels of SEND? Including those with sensory impairments? Can it ever provide a blended alternative?
I really think this is an important question, because what we're not trying to achieve is, because I don't think we can achieve it, is to replace school. What we're trying to build is a resource bank, and I'm using the word trying because we're constantly refining and trying to improve. But what we're trying to do is build an online resource bank that can be drawn on by schools, by families, to enrich what's already there. And I think for those families that have drawn on this when maybe there isn't anything else there at the moment, I'm really hearing and thinking on and trying to find a way around some of those points around differentiation, which I'd like to come back to in a second. But what we're trying to do is offer resources that will fit in with as many school curriculums as possible, so they can be deployed to families, to children who, whether they're shielding or self-isolating or unable to come in for any reason. I think what we discovered around SCND was really complex. So the idea of a separate send offer was something we didn't want to do. We wanted to try and build as inclusive features into as much of the mainstream core offer as possible, rather than suggest that all pupils with a form of SEND need something else. So some of the elements that we did to try and achieve that was making sure we had subtitles added, that we used British Sign Language, that we had really well-designed inclusive slides that could work for as many children with vision impairment as possible, that we had very clear sequenced explanations within lessons, so that the delivery of content was paced well. The use of pause points could really allow children to take time to complete tasks that they were either really into and wanted to extend, or to take a little bit of extra time to work on if they needed to. And that they could also rewind content and rewatch it, which in a traditional classroom, that's something you wish you could do. You wish you could kind of have yourself stored somewhere and a child could rewind as they need to. But what can't we do? You know, we can't catch issues that come up in real time in these on-demand lessons. You know, the teacher has recorded these in their evenings and weekends and spare time when they're not with their classes. So they're not there in real time in the home. It's really difficult to track kind of the actual learning you get from engaging with one of these lessons, because it is a resource. You know, we're calling them lessons, but they're resources, really. And we can't replace, in terms of differentiation, the individual knowledge the teacher needs to have around that child. So to make that broader mainstream offer as inclusive as possible, we think SENCOs and teachers need to be looking at that content and then making the adaptations to it before it goes home to be used by families, and talking to the families about actually what is working and what isn't, because you can't replace that in an online bank. I hope we never can, actually, to some extent, because I think that real human connection and relationship and knowledge is important, but we're not pretending to. And as I said earlier, I think that probably means that if you are using our resource as the only home education, it probably feels like it's not good enough at the moment, because we're not trying to be a virtual school, even though we're called the Oak National Academy, but we are a resource bank. So we're trying very hard to keep tweaking the mainstream offer to make sure it is more relevant to more pupils. So in the lessons we're about to launch, that are being filmed as we speak, we're removing all reference to the year group that the content is aimed at. So you'll be able to deploy the lessons to any child that is working on that content without perhaps the stigma of being sent work from that's pitched at a different age of child, which might be disheartening. But I'm not naive about the fact that it probably could do more, and I think we need to think about the blended offer more in the round in terms of online one-to-one tuition, looking at some of the options that are coming forward, and encouraging more of that adaptation of existing resources that schools are sending home. I think there's been very little conversation about how you actually make remote learning as accessible as possible, and that's been really neglected in this time, which actually I don't think is on. But moving forward, accessible differentiated remote learning is a massive area of priority for us.
So obviously this has been quite a process for you, building the site and putting the resources together. What do you think that you've learned specifically about delivering SEND education remotely from this process? And how do you think that can help teachers looking towards remotely producing content for their children in the future?
So one of the biggest lessons we learned was that particularly for pupils that normally be in specialist settings due to cognition and learning or communication interaction needs, creating video content that was aimed at the child to engage with independently wasn't very successful, and was quite difficult for children to remain engaged with in a meaningful way, and actually risked at times being kind of edutainment rather than education. So what the specialist resources that I'm responsible for and overseeing seek to do is something a bit different. So we've completely changed our approach for the latest batch of content, in that we are creating videos, slide packs, something we're calling recipe cards at the moment, but we might call something else when they're finished, which help create a learning environment in the home for the family. So we're actually looking at creating resources that schools can use with parents, with siblings, to create an authentic learning experience at home with objects that you will have around the home, so that you can develop things like numeracy together rather than expect the video to kind of work for every child. And that's been quite a difficult shift, and thinking about how we make sure we are not making assumptions about what a family will have to hand, because we don't want anyone to have to go out and get anything. That's completely against the point of what we're trying to achieve. But also, how do you teach things like creative arts, numeracy, and communication and language authentically and well in this medium? So we're enjoying that challenge. And actually, I'd really like to hear from any users who have a look at it when it comes out, if you think we've hit the mark or not. But that was the biggest learning, is the kind of traditional video, recorded video learning wouldn't work. We've also added in physical development lessons and an additional therapeutic offer of sensory integration, because we had a lot of feedback from families that they were very worried that the limited sensory diet during this period could be a barrier to returning to school in September. So we're hoping by introducing that new therapeutic element that we can provide something that will be useful to the families to draw on to prepare their youngsters to go back to school.
So you're hoping that it's going to be continuing to be used during the summer. And it seemed to have been started out just by a group of teachers getting together and putting something out. But with your involvement and with the government money, it has developed. So is it becoming part of the government's offer, or how has it developed since the early days?
So it started as a kind of grassroots WhatsApp group, I think. I wasn't involved in that very first iteration, but I think a group of teachers and leaders that had some capacity wanted to offer something to the sector to help where there wasn't the same capacity. And as I think you've alluded to, the specialist offer sort of came a couple of weeks behind, and we built up ahead of steam. We've got immense support from the Special Schools Teaching School Network, who are providing teachers from across the country to feed into this project. I think it's for the year ahead. We just don't know what's going to happen. Like, we don't know if there's going to be local lockdown, children shielding, a second spike, an extended first spike, etc. So at the moment, it's there as something to be drawn on, as schools are, trying to get every child back in September, which we probably all have a view on, and trying to manage running the school safely for all pupils, whilst also dealing with the fact that they might have staff or pupils that are shielding, that are out, perhaps affected by a local lockdown. And it's there for schools to draw on if it's helpful, for families to draw on if it's helpful. No one has to use it. No one has to like it even. But it's just there to kind of make sure there's some support. In terms of longer term, I think that's difficult. I've learned a lot about copyright in this time and getting permissions for things. And so a lot of that is time limited due to a lot of goodwill during COVID. So I think the kind of very long term kind of role of the project is up in the air. But one of the things I found very interesting and felt quite privileged to be part of is actually, I'm sure your listeners are aware, there isn't a national curriculum for special schools. There isn't a lot of kind of national agreement about what that curriculum looks like. And actually having that opportunity to draw teachers and parents connected to different schools together to share actually what could we do with the resource we have here, what is a common core we could do, has been really rewarding. And trying to find some common language when subjects are called really different things, and the way kind of knowledge is grouped together, and should we have age specific content, should we have developmental stages, what should we call those, how do we pitch this content? I don't think we'd have ever had that discussion without something like this, because schools kind of have their thing and run with it. But I think hopefully from a more policy point of view, it's the start of kind of getting under the skin of what is our national expectation for the curriculum in special schools, and what should it look like, and recognising the massive diversity of pupils within those schools. I think it is helpful to develop a common language. So selfishly, I hope that's the start of something, but I don't think we finished it. I think we've just shown it's possible to start the conversation.
From a usability point of view, do you think that the website is easy for parents of children with special educational needs to use? I had a look around the site, and at the moment on the homepage, you've got a button that says, for pupils with additional needs, please select specialists to follow our specialist curriculum. And then when you click through, what you're seeing is options that are mainly based around life skills and therapies. And obviously the majority of children have a much more diverse curriculum than this. And I know you've said that you're trying to incorporate these more into sort of like what's on offer for everyone else, but that's not necessarily apparent for parents who are visiting your site. So rather than kind of like putting out something that perhaps gives the impression that you have quite low expectations for children with special educational needs, how are you going to make your site more user-friendly for those parents who are going on there looking for some support for their child's curriculum?
Completely agree with everything you just said, by the way. I think we're going to change how the information is presented quite significantly, so it should be much easier to navigate and to search by different subject areas and different starting points within the curriculum. We've tailored the content to 3 starting points, which was really difficult to agree, but I think being able to kind of pick out those different levels will make it easier. And I mean, as you've said, it is quite difficult at the moment to kind of zone in on the content that's there and see everything. So improving the navigation and the clarity is there. And the curriculum maps for what we're hoping to put out are also available for anyone to download and have a look at. So you'll be able to see the content of the lessons and the units that we're putting together and cherry pick the bits that are most appropriate. But yeah, if people can't find our content, then we can't expect them to use it. So
have you considered being able to cross-reference? So if people are looking for specific support needs, that actually they can then find, you know, examples of lessons perhaps that have sign interpretation with them, so they can perhaps search using those functions?
Yeah, we're looking at increasing the kind of the tag function, so you can kind of select the filters and the tags that you need. I think it's safe to say that we're still kind of at building at pace point of view. So I'm looking forward to snagging kind of what actually is produced, because it's still in the kind of wireframe situation. But yeah, we're looking at trying to make it as searchable and as usable as possible. And I think you know, this is classic, isn't it? You try and slot a specialist offer into a mainstream offer and you find the structures don't quite work. And surprise, it didn't work as well as it might. But we're trying to refine it moving forward.
So what kind of feedback have you had from, because you said you've had feedback from parents, so and for example, how are you, I mean, there's lots of other resources, the government's got its own list of resources, including BBC Bite Size. A lot of parents have been using that. How can you, for example, you know, have a lesson and say, want to know more about this, you know, find it there? Is that the kind of thinking that's going on, and what are parents telling you?
So on that kind of cross-posting point, we're trying not to replicate content that already exists, because that's not a good resource, and also trying to just credit people for what they've done appropriately and drive attention to that. So the feedback has been quite interesting. So we had feedback that'd be really useful for our materials to be downloadable, so they could be edited. And I see that as a really important element to make the whole curriculum more accessible, because I think that will enable teachers and families to make tweaks that are very specific to their context and their child. And at the moment, it is, because it's sort of on demand, it's limited by that. Copyright for download is interesting. We've learned a lot in getting permissions, but we're working on it really hard. We also heard that, you know, in the initial model, we were putting out lessons on a weekly basis. So the content for the week ahead would drop on the start of the week and so on. And that really wasn't flexible enough for families and schools to see what was coming and to plan. So we're dropping the whole year's content over the summer, ready for September. So it will all be there. And we're kind of, I have a tracker kind of as every lesson pings off and is completed, kind of seeing the journey toward that. So that was important feedback. Other feedback we had was that the kind of sequencing of material needed to be much clearer to see the kind of progression route. So we've worked in our curriculum plans to make sure that it's kind of clear what the learning journey is going to be throughout each unit. So you can start at a point that's most relevant, but also start at the unit that's most relevant. You don't have to start with lesson one and follow it through. And then specifically from families, we heard that a lot of siblings were working together on the specialist content, which is why we made that tweak from kind of just producing the material with the child to watch and engage with on their own, to actually making it a more interactive learning experience, because that's the feedback we had, that actually the parent, the sibling, the carer was expecting to support the child through the activity. So we've tried to put in guidance notes on how to make things easier or harder, or where to look next, where it might lead into the wider mainstream offer or across our offer, and tried to think about it as being kind of not trying to recreate the classroom at home, but use the home environment as a learning space.
I mean, talking of schools going back in September, obviously there'll be thousands of children with special educational needs and disabilities still at home, either because of health reasons or anxiety, or because they simply don't have provision in order for them to go to school. Is the OakAcademy specifically preparing for this as part, of what you'll be offering in September? Has this need been considered specifically, or is the content you produce just generally for all children?
So I think we're trying to do both. We're trying to make sure there's enough there for everyone that needs it. I think one of the pieces of feedback we early on looked at the user rates of different content that we were creating, and the content we created at the early development level, we weren't seeing a huge amount of uptake initially. So we were actually thinking at one point of dropping that moving forward. But then when we spoke to families and spoke to schools, we realised that that was the content that was going to be most essential for pupils that were staying at home, and that we actually had to increase the energy and output that we were putting there to make sure that there was enough to create a rich and meaningful offer at home if it was needed. So certainly on the specialist side, we're really kind of trying to make sure there's something viable there. And across that mainstream offer, by making some of the tweaks around the presentation of the lessons, the pace of the lessons, we're trying to make them as inclusive as possible. But we don't think we can replace the school. And you'll have noticed in what I've said thus far, I haven't mentioned pupils with SEMH needs. And I'd be like totally here for it if you wanted to challenge me on that, because obviously that's a huge part of our population. But we thought it was really important that we didn't try to replace what schools should be doing in that space, and it'd be very difficult to offer something nuanced enough to be meaningful, and not actually maybe risk not helping and maybe putting a clumsy resource in. So there are some things we have chosen not to do because we think schools really should do that and should preserve the space. And we could talk about how well they're able to do that, of course. But I think when you're creating an online resource, like being upfront about what you can't do as well as a school is quite important.
And of course, you don't want to make it easier for schools to say, well, just go home, you can learn from OakAcademy tomorrow.
Yeah, and that's, I've had some really interesting Twitter exchanges recently where some parents have been fobbed off with, oh, you don't worry about not having a named school for September because you can use this. And that is not what this is for. That is totally inappropriate. We are not a school. This is a resource bank. That's a little bit like saying you can use Wikipedia, to be honest. It's not a good substitute. And there are some things that we don't think we can offer online. Maybe others can, but not on.
I think something that came to mind would be some things that maybe schools don't necessarily have time for in PHSE and emotional well-being. I mean, I know there's mental health apps, coming out of everywhere, but things like budgeting and decision making and learning resilience and things that maybe schools don't do so well because they don't have the curriculum space. Would there be any call, or is that kind of something that you might be thinking about?
Yeah, so a lot of that content is being introduced in the next development stage. So particularly around the PSHE and citizenship content on the mainstream side, and in our independent living side, we've done a lot on sort of financial independence and healthy relationships. And
not just for SEND.
No. So within our mainstream offer, it's present as well. But to be honest, I think some of our specialist lessons are applicable right across that mainstream sphere. Just because it's labelled as that doesn't mean that no one else can draw on it, which is something I really like about Oak. It was one of the things that appealed to me, was that you could really cherry pick the resources from across the whole offer to where the child is right now, in a way that's really hard in a traditional school where the timetable is what it is and the classes seem quite fixed. That there's nothing stopping a child working on lessons from different subject areas that they might not study, or different year groups. So I think you could be quite creative with it, and as long as the child is enjoying and engaging, you can deploy that kind of as works. Really, you're not limited to what's in one category or in one subject.
Can I ask, at the moment your curriculum only goes up to year 10. Is there a reason for that, and are you planning on adding any GCSE content or post-16 content?
Yeah, so originally the reason was capacity in the original sprint, and kind of figuring out the boundaries around what people had the time to do. We are introducing a lot more Key Stage 4 content, which is primarily GCSE content. At the moment, specific post-16 content that differs from the Key Stage 4 or Key Stage 3 content isn't on the cards, but it is something a lot of people are asking about. So, we're hearing that. Then I think there are elements from across the curriculum that continue to be relevant and interesting. So hopefully there are things there that can be used in that space.
And what about, the next 10,000 hours? So you've been funded for the first 10,000 hours, but presumably lessons are going to need to be updated as curriculum changes. So things like, Black history, climate change, disability history, all these things that we don't get in schools, but are increasingly important for children to understand about if we're going to change the mindset of young people going forward and create a more equitable society. Is this a space that can happen?
I think it's a potential space. I mean, the funding is kind of set for the moment, and certainly on the history content space, it was impossible and inappropriate to ignore what was going on alongside the development of this curriculum, with the Black Lives Matter, trying to think of the right word, movement, I suppose. And so that has been reflected within the curriculum plans for this curriculum, and making sure that it's not that it is a curriculum that works for as many children as possible is really important, and that it is a curriculum that is relevant and resonates. But could we do more? Yes. Is this an opportunity? Yes. Will the government keep funding it? I don't know. We'll find out, I suppose. But it has been, and one of the things I'm really excited with the specialist offer is we've commissioned masterclasses in physical development and creative arts, which are elite masterclasses and are relevant to anyone that's interested, and hopefully showcase that disability is not something over here. Actually, our achievements are relevant and of value and of interest and import, and I'm quite excited, and I think that's quite powerful. And
it could actually be used for adult education as well.
I spoke to some colleges this week about a number of things, but they were talking about the potential use for revision, because it might not be how you choose to introduce materials necessarily if you're able to have face-to-face lessons, but actually for revising topics and recapping, it could be really useful.
Well, thank you so much for joining us once again, and we really, really appreciate your time. We hope that we've helped kind of explain some of the things and some of the thinking going on behind OakAcademy and your plans moving forwards. If parents have feedback on your content, or you have teachers who want to perhaps offer some quality lessons, how can they get in touch with you?
Reach out to me on Twitter or get in touch with the OakAcademy.
Right, and thank you once again, and we hope you'll come back with an update on how it's developing, maybe in 6 months' time. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.